All right. First of all, I apologize. I'm conducting this meeting with a train track like right outside my window, so you'll probably hear the Dinky Express coming by every 20 minutes or so. So Fernando, hopefully it's nostalgic for you and not annoying. Welcome everybody. We'll get started. So thanks to everyone for coming today. This event is after oh, Dinky. This event is After Divestment, What Comes Next? I'm Ryan Worsing with Divest Princeton, and before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that Princeton sits on land that's been taken from the Lenni Lenape tribe, and if not for the pandemic, we would be hosting this event on that land today. The pandemic and climate change have both disproportionate impacts on Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color, and on other groups living in frontline communities. This is why today's discussion is so timely and so necessary. We're joined by two guests who have lived their lives and careers on the razor's edge of climate change and who can speak to the challenges of our moment better than anyone else. They are Fernando Cazares. Fernando has spent a career in climate activism and organizing Latinx communities. He was a field organizer and deputy Latino vote director with Organizing for America and a Los Angeles regional coordinator with the Natural Resources Defense Council. He ran the Trust for Public Lands Climate Smart Cities Initiative in the state of California, and most recently served as the National Director for CHISPA. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Fernando? Right on. The League of Conservation Voters Latino Climate Action Program. He also holds an MPA from Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, class of 2004. Welcome, Fernando. And Veronica Coptis. Veronica came to the Center for Coalfield Justice as a community organizer in 2013 and has since risen to serve as executive director. She grew up in western Greene County, Pennsylvania, near the Bailey Mine Complex, and now lives in the eastern part of the county. She is a former organizer with the Mountain Watershed Association and a previous chapter chair of the Pennsylvania Sierra Club. She has experience with the intersectional impacts of energy extraction and the economy. Welcome to Veronica. So the first question that we have today, the format-wise, it'll be about 45 minutes or so of questions from us, and we'll leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. So throughout the conversation, if you have any questions that you're inspired to ask, just drop them in the chat, and we'll try to, call them together and ask them at the end of the chat. So the first question we have is, first, just why don't you both tell us just a little bit about yourselves and what brought you to your environmental work and how has that work evolved with climate change? And we'll have Veronica, why don't you go first?
Okay, so I am the director at the Center for Coalfield Justice. We are an environmental and economic justice advocacy organization that works in 2 counties in the southwestern corner of Pennsylvania. For those who may not be familiar with Pennsylvania, it's one of the states that has the 3rd largest regional greenhouse gas emissions that come out of it. We're also in like the top 10 coal producing states and one of the top states that is extracting natural gas. And the 2 counties that we live in and work in is like 80% of the fossil fuel extraction in the entire state comes out of these 2 counties. And so I got engaged in this work because I grew up next to the largest underground coal mining operation in the country and was just directly impacted. I was running around in the hills of western PA, and all of a sudden we couldn't go into this valley anymore because it was now going to be filled in with toxic waste from the coal mine. And that was my introduction into the power and the control in which one industry had over our community for this promise of prosperous jobs that were supposed to go to locals in the community. And my trajectory I usually describe is, for about 5-ish years, I was just really angry and I yelled and was vocal around everyone in my town about how much I hated the coal industry and what it was doing to our communities. And the one thing I'll note now is there's a lot of privilege I had to be able to do that. No one in my family was dependent upon jobs in that industry. And so there was no repercussion the company could take on me or my loved ones, which gave me the ability to have a very outward vocal voice in opposition. I didn't realize that at the time, but now it's a very critical point to share in these communities. And then I accidentally found the Center for Coalfield Justice because of a massive fish kill that had happened in the region. And, from there, I learned about the systemic ways in which environmental harm is happening in our communities. And I had great mentors that refined my anger into organizing and strategy and campaigning to create real change in our communities. And from there, they invested in my leadership and I became the director. And I share that because there are leaders in all of these directly impacted communities that are waiting for investment in their skills that can become powerful leaders in civic institutions, in government, that are rooted in what people's real struggles are. And it's the direction I think we need to go moving forward in our country, is to move these folks into governing our country.
Great. And how about Fernando?
Thank you, Veronica, for getting us. So I come at the environmental climate space not from the traditional channels. I studied urban regional planning in grad school. I've been more of a public policy generalist, if you will, since undergrad. So my on-ramp to the climate movement was in 2012, having, as Ryan mentioned, having worked for the Organizing for America, the Obama re-election campaign. I was based in both Vegas and Reno. So I was tasked with many other great organizers with the goal of registering a lot of Latina new voters, empowering, training them on the tools of organizing themselves, their families and neighbors, their classmates, and people they went to church with, registering them to vote, teaching them about the importance of not only electing people but holding them accountable. I was really inspired by a lot of what these folks were doing. Some of them in high school, some of them grandparents. Some of them juggling one or two jobs. I was really inspired by their courage and their conviction, and also just the path of, as Veronica mentioned, like these regular folks, taking a step forward to speak up for their family and friends. So I went through a period of deciding whether or not I wanted to make a career in running elections, doing the campaign world, and if folks out there deserve plenty of caffeine and whatever peaks that they, for the rest of their lives, are organizers and campaigns. That is really hard work and not the best paid. But anyway, I chose not to go that route, but instead I chose to take at that moment it was a fellowship with this organization, with the Natural Resources Defense Council. My former boss, who welcomed me into the climate space, I created a program called Voces Verdes, or Green Voices. Her approach to getting Latina leaders seen and heard in the national discourse around the Clean Power Plan, the Obama Clean Power Plan, was that she was going to identify, recruit, and train and empower, quote unquote, leaders of academic institutions, business owners, environmental justice leaders, religious leaders, and youth. So it was my job to go to 3 particular states: Illinois, Georgia, and Colorado, and identify a lot of these Latinx leaders, understand what their struggles were. So I think one of the principles of organizing is you don't show up selling something. You don't try to convince somebody to jump on your bandwagon. You got to get to know them. You got to earn people's trust. So I was really humbled about how people were opening up to me. Anyhow, that was my entryway into the climate space. I then followed it up with another opportunity to work in the Trust for Public Land. I think I've been guided by 2 principles or 2 visions of mine, and that is, how do you, as Veronica mentioned, is how does climate and environmental crisis or policies, how does that intersect with people's daily lives, whether it's through the jobs they have access to, whether they, the public transit systems they have access to. I mean, that's the urban regional planning kicking in me. Is I try to understand the energy world, not just from the extraction and the refinery and then the production and the delivery, but how does it impact people's daily lives? And so I had an opportunity to work in the Trust for Public Land in the program called Climate Smart Cities. And again, my role was to play quarterback to a lot of sectors: nonprofit, local government, environmental justice, academics, and implementers. And in my role, I've always considered myself an advocate. So I made an extra effort to get environmental justice voices and leaders recognized in this roundtable, so that we could understand the climate impact and opportunity to remake our communities to be climate resilient, energy efficient, and we have to be really explicit about racially and economically just communities. And then, as Ryan mentioned, the last role I had Legal Conservation Voters, running a program called Chispa, which just means spark in Spanish. It's a model to develop leadership from community members, youth, parents, and grandparents. Train them about what does it mean to actually hold people accountable once they're elected in office, or public officials, and then get them deployed out to public utility commissions, planning commissions, park commissions, and yes, to protest a lot of the oil refineries. So that's sort of like my approach and my experience in the climate space so far.
Great. Well, next question we have is, one of the reasons that we're so interested in getting the both of you together is that you have such different backgrounds, but a common purpose. How do you balance the work that you do in your individual communities with the work that you do as part of the broader climate movement? And do you really consider it a balance at all? Are you conscious of going back and forth from one to the other? Either one, whoever wants to go first with that.
Yeah, I mean, like for me, it's really not that different. And so like I live, it's actually for a lot of larger environmental organizations and like statewide coalitions, if they're not on the front lines, their staff, there is a disconnect between like where the harm is being felt and often the people that are staffed in some of these larger environmental institutions. And so you can like go to your day job, read about the harms, go home and not feel the impact. But for our team, we work around reducing the harms from fossil fuel extraction, and we go home and see the gas wells in our backyard or the coal mine permit that we know is approaching nearby. And I'm a mom of 2 girls. It's like their future, what is at stake is really what's at hand right now, and how our government acts, and I'm sure a lot of you who are younger are thinking that same thing, like what is the future you're going to have moving forward. The other thing with me that I think about with climate is that climate is not the systemic cause. It is not the root. It is a symptom of racialized capitalism running rampant in our country. And, so the way people are feeling economic injustice is deeply connected to the way people are feeling climate injustice and environmental harm. And we really need to address how our local governments solicit economic development, how we look at who controls our economy. And so I look at the way that I do this work and a lot of our team members do this work. It's about the survival of our families and the places that we live, and whether we're going to be able to continue to support our families, keep food on the table, and not have our health sacrificed in the process moving forward. I think a lot of where it differs for me, I spend a lot of time in climate movement spaces, often being the one in the space saying like, hey, that policy actually isn't going to help anybody on the ground. Or like, do we really need to talk so much about carbon numbers? Like that actually doesn't mean anything to the people who are living on the front lines of these communities. Like we need to do that stuff, but can we message it in a way that'll mobilize more support? But when you're struggling financially, the last thing you're worrying about is like how much the cap is going to be in the RGGI limit that your state is trying to pass moving forward too. And so I probably spend more time in conflict with the larger climate movement in a good way, to push them, to nudge them to follow the leadership of those most impacted. But on the ground in our communities, it's all the same fight to us to get more control for our communities and the government.
Fernando, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. So I have, it's been a balance. I'm not gonna, I've worked in, 3 large environmental organizations. I've, have worked in DC doing the national work, and I've worked in LA doing, running a statewide program, and I worked in LA, LA specific, and LA County it's a monster. So by nature you're not going to be able to be everywhere. So I think how I've been able to balance it is, being very aware of who I am. I'm an immigrant from Mexico. I grew up in South Central LA. I grew up in an overcrowded house until I went to college, and then I had a roommate in the same room. I took public transit. My first experience taking public transit was middle school and high school, because the schools that were in my neighborhood were not quality, safe and quality. So, recognizing that, my experience around my childhood and my experience in the U.S. has been around dependence on the traditional public safety network of public transit, access to good schools, and so what's kept me anchored is not only my story, but it's also been my organizing my organizing experiences. Wherever I have worked, I have first and foremost wanted to meet the leaders of the organizations. I wanted to try to understand the world in which they live in. So, again, when I've worked on, land use policies and advocacy around, safe walking and biking, I don't approach it from the traditional mindset. I really want to understand what does a day, look like for families that are going to work, mothers that are taking their kids to school. When I worked on clean energy policy, I showed up to communities in, Little Village in south side of Chicago, not showing up to talk about, as was mentioned, it's not showing up talking about the greenhouse gas caps or the percentage of clean energy goals that the state needed to meet. Rather, I showed up to listen and understand what was going on in that community and understand their fights. And one thing that has helped me balance is, plenty of times I found myself to be the only, man of color, the only immigrant, the only one that's pushing from, big, large, white-led, privileged institutions that have been around for 40, 50 years, pushing them to think outside of the traditional advocacy or legal fights or scientific arguments for why fossil fuels are bad or what the right target should be, but pushing them to understand what this means for people's, economic opportunities, quality of healthcare or quality of health outcomes, and ultimately reminding them that this fight isn't just, legal, isn't just lobbying, isn't just electoral. This fight is at every level, and that we need to include the leaders of environmental justice and community-led organizations at the table as partners, not as not retail transactions that we're asking them for, to put their organization on the letter or to get them to testify in support or in opposition to, but we need to build a long-term relationship.
Great, thanks for that. So, obviously this title of the event today is, it's all about reinvestment. We've been up to now really, really focused as a group on divesting the university's endowment, but the conversation hasn't really evolved too much into the, how do we reinvest that money that is divested? Some would say that the best way to make up for our past support of the fossil fuel industry is to take all that investment and put it toward alternative energy and assets that would encourage decarbonization. Is that position consistent with reinvestment in frontline communities? And if it's not, what should we prioritize? Where should the investments go first? And Veronica, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I feel like this is a conversation I've been having with partners since the divestment campaign really had started. And there was a crew of Frontline, a lot of Frontline Coalfield communities that had kind of were like, hey, if you pull all this money away from coal, in particularly, because I think in the beginning the ask was just to divest from coal, not all fossil fuels, is that, you are also going to leave our communities high and dry in terms of jobs, tax revenue. Like the coal companies are the center pillar of what is driving the economy in some of these towns. And so we pushed on can we actually talk about, if you pull that money, where that money goes, because there's inequity in that stance too. And so I think, it isn't necessarily a win if you divest everything from fossil fuels and just reinvest it into solar, wind, and batteries, because it depends upon really the hyper local level and how those divestments are impacting communities across the country that may be dependent upon those industries for, holding up their, and so an example is like the county I live in Greene County, about 20 to 30% of the economy is rooted in the energy extraction sector. And 40% of the county's budget comes from coal tax revenue. And in some of the school districts, 60% of their budget comes from coal tax revenue. So if all of those companies shut down abruptly, we would see, significant decline in social services. We would see schools continue to crumble, and you would see mass flight out of the communities because people who have the resources are gonna leave and go somewhere else. And the burden that happens is those who had the least already are left with like little to nothing to pick up the pieces and try to rebuild. And so when we talk about reinvestment in some of the just transition spaces we're in, some other universities and divestment groups are talking about just taking, not all of it, because the funds do have to generate some revenue. You know, they're helping cover pensions, different costs, things like that. There is revenue that has to be generated, and there is revenue that can be generated from untraditional investments into initiatives and projects as well. But that you take a section of the investment that the universities have and allow it to be used for social enterprises in some of these towns, or different like funding of small businesses and entrepreneurs that are popping up from the locals who are there, to be, you know, startup funds for mom and pop shops and locally owned stuff to start thriving and supporting the economy. And also when we look at renewable, this is like maybe not a favorable position for some environmental groups, but it's not actually a win to our organization if some big outside entity builds a massive solar farm in our community, because it's actually more about how energy democracy and economic democracy and how we control what comes in. So you could look at investing things like economic cooperatives that are starting to pop up that give communities a lot more power and control too, which like can have a significant amount of return. It's just not the traditional way we go to thinking about how we invest money to get the biggest return. So I just think encouraging you to think outside the box around what's possible. And I would encourage connections to the Just Transition Fund that has worked on this across the country and has connections with a lot of different like financial capitalists and things like that that are looking at this from a really creative way too.
Great. Fernando?
Yeah, so I would say for the partners that I've worked with, you know, plus one in Veronica's, you know, description of the struggle is that you can't take one without, you know, being able to transition into accessible and equitable, you know, job opportunities. So the just transition is, you know, front and center. What I would also point to is that, you know, the environmental justice organizations I've gotten to partner with have been pretty also vocal about, in particular, you know, one industry, the clean goods, the freight movement industry. You know, the ports of LA and Long Beach in Southern California. Something between 40 to 60% of all the goods that are imported into the U.S. go through those particular ports, and so that means that, you know, there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of diesel burning trucks that pretty much go from the ports of Long Beach into pretty already low-income communities of color and all the way inland into the mainland U.S. And those communities are the ones that are not only have to deal with the oil refineries along the ports, but also have to then, you know, inhale all that diesel, you know, fumes from the freight transportation sector. So I would say that the particular the organization I had a chance to work with they're called the ECR Communities for Environmental Justice. They are part of a national network called the Moving Forward Network. I encourage you to look them up. They are leading a national campaign to get the freight industry, you know, from not only the trucks that move the goods, but also the you know, forgive my lack of full knowledge of the industry, but all the equipment that is used to pull the goods out of the ships, and also the ships themselves. Is how do you get all that directly into the electric transportation you know, system, so that we don't so that those communities actually get the direct benefits of clean air. But also, as Veronica mentioned, is that in investing in, you know, clean transportation sector, how do you not go in the same route of giving the money directly to the companies, but how do you do it in a way that, you know, the truck drivers and the communities along the corridor benefit from the clean transportation? So whether that means they're going to have access to, you know, clean vehicles themselves, clean infrastructure themselves. So I think I would say it's the right approach, but I think you have to be really careful. And as Veronica said before, is how you make sure that you're designing this transition not top down, but you're designing it, bottom up and left and right in, so that everyone who's suffering from the fossil fuel industry now is part of designing the industry and the economic opportunities they want to have in the new clean energy world.
Cool. I, I think that's really interesting, both of those answers, because it's a lot of what we get in return when we talk to people about divestment is that it's all about return on investment. That ultimately the endowment is kind of agnostic to social need, and that it's got to just, I mean, it's just cold numbers. And so I wonder how much that is just the reality. How much should we work within that framing? Or would either of you say, my answer, my guess is your answers might be pretty brief here, but would either of you say that institutions of privilege like ours have more of a moral and ethical responsibility to invest in frontline communities, sort of regardless of the ROI? And if the ROI lines up, great, but it's not a necessary component.
And I would say, I think a great framing of the question. What I would also say is, privileged, I think, really pushing institutions like Princeton to really own the privilege and the white supremacy and the top-down economics, structure that allowed it to be where it is, that it needs to be dismantled, period. That this focus on return on investment is really, I would say, at best myopic, at worst self-serving, and continues to feed on, the structure of, white supremacy and economic extraction. So I would push institutions like Princeton that that's not an acceptable answer, period. Two, I would, institutions like Princeton really are supposed to be in the service of, higher learning and the, objective search for truth. And I would push them to say, look, the fossil fuel industry and this return on investment is really not an honest measure, because we're, under our traditional economic structure, we're not capturing all the externalities that the extraction of the fossil fuel industry creates, the processing and the use of fossil fuels and the delivery of fossil fuels, that the sector itself is not capturing externalities, period, and that people are, there's public health costs, there's many other, civil rights implications to this structure. So I would push Princeton to say this ROI mindset is not in line with what you as an institution say you're striving to. And I would, third, I would point to, solar and, other forms of clean energy are now cost competitive, if not more cheaper than fossil fuels. So I would say that answer is the lazy answer, and it's a self-serving answer, and it's not acceptable in our current age.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly in this political moment is like really the window for you to push them around equity and privilege that the institution has and has had and continues to uphold, and the barriers of people without that level of access from getting, that information and the knowledge that Princeton can serve. I also think is like reframing what is investment, like money isn't the only thing that can get you a return on investment. And is it better for the greater good of the country or the greater good of the communities if we're also investing in places and in people and in cultures too? I think we're so like in this box that money equals success or good or whatever. And when you really, we work mostly with poor people, and like we don't really think about money that way, and there's like so many things that are assets that are investments that Princeton could be investing in with their money that is actually going to be a net gain for the country. If those investments are making sure people's needs are met, then we're going to have a much more engaged and diverse and culturally rich country if folks aren't constantly struggling to survive.
I like that answer a lot. And that's definitely what we're striving for here, is to take more of a holistic approach to, are we growing together or are we growing separately? One of the other things that we hear from a lot of administrators and people in power here particularly is that there is a presumption against using the endowment for position taking, is the way that it's usually framed. And so that basically means that we can't really be activist investors with our endowment no matter what. Rather, the university says that the best way we contribute to the dialogue and we add to progress is through the research that we conduct. And at Princeton, kind of maybe frustratingly, you can't divest without completely dissociating from the industries and the companies from which you are divesting your money. So that would mean to some people that we can't have research relationships with these companies if we also aren't going to be investing in them as companies. There's a lot of gray area as to what that really means. It's never really been put to practice with divestment from fossil fuels. But having said all that, do you think that just strictly through the research that Princeton is doing, do you think it's enough for them to do just that? Do you think, and I guess in a broader sense, when you look at an institution like Princeton, do you look at us as an ally to the kind of work that you're doing, or more, are we irrelevant? Are we an obstacle to the work that you're doing? Fernando, I mean, you're an alumni of Princeton. How are your views of the school affected now that you're actually on the front line or working with frontline communities?
Yeah, and I take the research as that's what you do. So like that in itself is like not an acceptable answer, I think. And I go back to the principle of if you took that approach, then this global movement against the apartheid system of South Africa would not have happened, right? So like we cannot, I think our current days and our current realities, no one with privilege, and let alone $26 billion of endowment, should stay on the sidelines. And research in and itself is what you as an institution were created to do. So like that is a moot point to me, because what institutions right now are demanded are to put their values into bring them into light. So again, I go back to what is Princeton value system, and we need to push it to put their money where their value statement is and the mission statement. And I just think that we cannot afford the luxury of letting this approach of agnostic, return on investment, or not taking a political stance. I think this is an existential threat to everyone's livelihood, but people of color and indigenous and Black are paying the price for the choices that we as a system make. And I think by not taking a choice, I would also frame it as like you're choosing not to take a stand means that you're actually taking a stance to maintain the system that has given us all these racial and economic injustices. So I don't buy that argument from Princeton.
Yeah, I would agree with Fernando that in this moment, there is no way, like you're taking a position no matter what you're doing. You're either just like taking a position of silence, which means you're complacent and okay with the harm that's happening, or you're taking a position to actively try to change it. The other thing with research that we run into a lot as well is like, we definitely look at extraction of the resources, but there are multiple levels of extraction that can happen in communities. And often academic institutions like Princeton, even though they're like doing research to better the communities, often the research itself can be highly extractive. And so they come into these towns, they listen to these stories, then they write their papers, they get the publication, and like nothing ever returns back to the community. And this actually was like, I got a bachelor's of science in biology, and I was going to go to grad school, and I was like, research can solve all the problems, and that was my trajectory for a while. And then I just found out how inaccessible all this research was to the communities that really needed it. And that is when I redirected to doing community organizing and community-based work, because there's a huge disconnect between academia and those that are struggling. right now. And so I think, if you are, I think many of you are grad students, and I talk to journalists and researchers all the time, and I say, like, is what you're doing just benefiting you, or is it actually benefiting the people you're collecting stories from or data from, and to really reframe it that way. And I think, more academic institutions are leaning that way, but that's also how, like, they can take a position where their money is, and they need to take positions in how they engage in research to be regenerative and not extractive as well.
We're really trying to see that connection between divestment and dissociation as a positive rather than a negative, and an opportunity for us to actually take ourselves out of some of these just horrible research relationships that greenwash these companies. And I think that framing that research as extractive is something we haven't really thought about before. So we've got a few more questions here. And I would like to encourage people to drop more questions in the chat if they have any, because we're approaching our mark where we'll start pulling from the chat. Obviously, we couldn't hold this event so close to the election without at least referencing the election and how that bears on the work that we're all doing. So I'll start now with Fernando. And the question here is, the both of you represent areas that are very much under the microscope for how they voted in the past election. And Fernando, Latinx voters in some areas voted overwhelmingly for Biden. In some other areas, like West Texas, where there's a lot of oil, you had Tejano voters voting for President Trump. And in Miami as well, you had kind of a mix. So obviously that's a reminder that uniform labels like Latinx often fail to describe diverse groups of people. How do you approach this range of backgrounds and geographies and political and economic interests with your work, and how does energy fit into that process?
Thank you. There's plenty of reading going on about who Latinos, Hispanics voted, and I would say it's not a surprise, to me. I mean, I would say, the people who come from, the Latin American experience, having been colonized by, the Spanish, empire, and having inherited, systems of oppression ourselves, based on color, based on race, based on gender, based on classism, I'm not surprised. And I'm still, I'm not surprised. I think there's also a lot of research and layering about, both in Texas and in Florida and in California and other new states. There's also interesting research about new voters in states like Wisconsin and Minnesota and the Midwest and Michigan, that at the county level, that there were new Latino voters that went with Biden, right? So I would, to directly answer your question, I say that it's important not to, there's an old saying that I learned in 2000 after undergrad. I did a fellowship called the Core Leadership Fellowship, and one of the principles they taught us is the map is not the territory. That just because someone gives you a map, as someone else saw it 10 years ago, 100 years ago, and that includes labels as well, does not mean that you understand the territory. And you have to get off your car, your horse, whatever metaphor you want to use. But you got to get down and speak to people and understand people. And I would say, the work that Veronica is doing and the work that organizers are doing, that is the bread and butter of long-term power building from the bottom up. And that, there's plenty of wisdom that I'm going to say that neither of the traditional two-party system that we have in the U.S. That we call democracy, which that's another conversation. I would say that neither party has done a good job in really building long-term relationship with the so-called new citizens or new Americans, quote unquote. And that is to really do the organizing, do the relationship building. And, the theme of Veronica's great point is that when elections happen every 2 or 4 years, that these national political parties or independent expenditures or unions or whatever political player comes into a state, into a community, that they don't do it in the extractive way. Like, I was very mindful when I worked in the Obama campaign that I was there for 10 months. And then after the 10 months were done, I had to leave. So I didn't feel right that there were all this infrastructure and money that was invested, but it wasn't invested in the organizations that were doing the community organizing, the leadership development, the power building, the civic engagement that stayed behind. And so I would say that this election and the analysis that is going to come out really goes to the heart of our political institutions need to get the point that, you know, elections don't just happen every 2 years. Every single day is, you know, it's an individual choice that people make based on their economic reality, their public health, their, you know, housing and transportation. And unless we're able to build relationships and invest in organizations and leadership that really build a foundation every, you know, in the in-betweens, that we're going to have, you know, like what you just pointed, like South Miami having gone for, you know, Trump, and portions of Texas having gone for Trump. And so it, you know, there's in the clean energy side, clean energy is part of the process, but it needs to be, you know, ebbed into how people's experience their lives in this, what people now call the intersectionality of climate and clean energy with public health, racial and economic justice, access to affordable housing and whatnot. So I don't know if that gives you an answer.
It does, yeah. And to put it in a slightly different way to Veronica, you, as I said, you're the part of the country you are from, and I to a somewhat, you would say, would you say Pittsburgh's from the same part of the country, or would you say we're a different breed?
No, we're not totally different.
Okay. Well, the part of the country that we are from has been under the microscope for a long, long time for this Obama-Trump phenomenon that the media kind of obsesses about it, how voters were comfortable voting for Barack Obama, who had certain visions about the environment, and then moved to Donald Trump, who is sort of, you know, drill baby drill. I want to know, do you think that there is credence to this idea that gas politics and extractive industry politics and coal politics, are those permanently moving voters away from the Democratic Party? Are they permanently moving voters out of the political system altogether? And I guess what in your work and with the communities that you deal with, how much is climate a wedge issue, and how much does it reinforce people's identities one way or the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would start with, I mean, it's interesting that it's framed like Obama-Trump. So where we organize, I have to say, I think a lot of these divisions are falling along racial lines and less along energy lines. So maybe in like the greater Pittsburgh region, it was Obama-Trump, but when you get more into the rural areas, we work in 2 counties that were like all for Clinton, not for Obama, for Trump. And really the only reason when we were talking to folks on the ground that they didn't vote for Obama was because of his race. It really didn't have anything to do with his policy. So it's important to acknowledge that like racism and white supremacy is still deep in a lot of these places, particularly, I mean, even in the city of Pittsburgh, like the city of Pittsburgh story is like, it's great for who? Like, it's one of the worst places for Black women to live in the entire country. But it's, you know, doing great for the white millennials, upper class folks that are coming in to the city in these new tech jobs. And so, so I think in 2016, energy was a very critical thing that was discussed. It did sway a lot of decisions. And then the media was still hyper focused on it in 2020. But when we were so we ran a civic engagement program. We had over 3,000 conversations with voters in Washington and Greene counties. We, you know, did deep investment with about 300 of those folks around the issues that mattered to them. And they really didn't care about energy. Like, I think the media missed the whole boat this year that we're going through a global health crisis and people are losing work and don't have health care and are trying to figure out how they can afford a COVID test if they start to feel symptoms. Like, the only place for us to get a COVID test with no insurance in here is one CVS in the entire 2-county region. that's what's on the forefront of people's minds, and that was what folks were thinking about in this election, as well as the way the racial uprisings and the fight for Black lives was ramping up in the summer and is still going. That fear and the Trump campaign did a good job of pushing that division along race with middle-class white women, driving that fear with poor white folks too, that if Black people get liberated, it means you lose the little that you have, when we know it doesn't mean that. It means we all end up with what we need in the end. And so I think they tried to make fracking a hot button topic in Pennsylvania, which we thought was kind of funny, because when we were talking to folks, like, no one really cared about it, besides the people that worked directly in the industry. But the majority of the people really didn't care about what was going to happen with fracking or not. And like, the annoying thing to me, I'll say, is like, really the federal government has no authority over fracking in Pennsylvania. The state holds that authority. So it was kind of like, great, say what you want to say, president. It's a sovereign state that decides whether it happens or doesn't happen and how it happens too, as well. But I think the point that Fernando said is really what was instrumental in Pennsylvania in this last presidential election, which is the infrastructure. I think in 2020, there was an underestimated and a over assumption that not 2020, but 2016, Pennsylvania was going to go for Clinton. It was absolutely impossible for Trump to win the state. Where I live, I knew that wasn't what was going to happen, but Trump won the state in 2016, and all of a sudden there was a rethinking in how you do electoral work, and that this very transactional electoral work is not effective. It does not work. It's making communities feel even more disenfranchised with both parties, frankly. And so there, from 2017 to 2020, there has been statewide coalitions, many of which we're part of, that have been doing long-term progressive infrastructure in places in Pennsylvania, from the southwest corner where we are, to the greater Pittsburgh region, to Philadelphia, to the whole eastern side of the state, and then like Harrisburg. I think the whole we probably still have an organizing in the state is like North Central PA, but pretty much the rest of the state is covered with some organizing infrastructure, and that is what won in 2020. We did, our small part in it, but I would have to shout out to our partners at Make the Road PA, which is an immigrant-led Latinx community, and they, went in and pushed the Democratic leaders and were like, why are we focusing on the Obama-Trump voter that you explain here? There are way more people who aren't even engaged in the political system in the state. There are way more new immigrants in the state for the first time, and we're not talking to them about voting. And they, and it's a young, 20-some-year-old woman leader in Make the Road, who's an amazing person, who just pushed these like long-term political strategists, and they did it. And, everyone should thank Make the Road and 1PA and CASA for why Donald Trump is not still our president in the country, because that's why we won Pennsylvania. It wasn't because of what I think the national narrative is being said right now, but it was because of the hard work of women of color that turned out their communities and got the vote out and fought the whole week after the election to ensure every vote was counted, because there were real initiatives to try to stop the count, to throw out votes. A lot of voter suppression had happened the day of the election, and there was a very coordinated approach in Pennsylvania to ensure that voters decided who was going to be the president who won the state of Pennsylvania. And so I think energy plays a role, but I think when you get down to it, it's mostly that people are disenfranchised by both parties. And I think, we could have a whole conversation on the problem with the two-party system, as Fernando noted, but people are unhappy with both of them. And we're going into this next administration with that knowledge, with that the Democrats and the Republicans have never cared for our communities, have never had our best interest at hand. And now it's up to us as a community to actually take control and hold these elected officials accountable going forward.
Great. We've got a couple of questions here for you, and then we've got one final question for as well if we get to it, but if not, we'll just pref these ones from the chat. So the first question, Veronica, I'll just ask it to you because it's in reference to what you just said. Do you have any examples, either from the last election or previous elections, of what really good progressive organizing infrastructure might look like? Because we're at the low scale end of that. It's always good to aspire to what other people are doing.
I mean, it is identifying like who your strategic partners are across the state, you know, really trying to cover a whole geographic reach. And it's really just the like dirty, on the ground, not exciting work that you can't write fancy press releases about, of talking to folks. Where do they stand? Where's their pain at? What are their hopes and dreams? And then moving them into a leadership ladder to get engaged. And having like the rooting your electoral work in issues, not just in candidates. So figuring out what the issues are that matter, identifying candidates that will run and speak to those issues of the people most harmed by it, and then mobilizing people to stand behind folks who hopefully they come from their communities, look like them, understand their struggles to get into those positions of power. And it's starting at the school board, all the way from the school board level up to, you know, your governor, your federal representatives. It's like, the local government engagement in elections is the stepping stones to getting your people into leadership at higher levels.
Great. And this next one is for Fernando. The question is, what do you see as the future for Latinx support within the progressive wing of the Democratic Party? So not just the party in general, but the progressive wing.
It's a great question. I think.
Sorry, that was my fault.
No worry. I would say the answer is there's great potential both on the progressive side of the Democratic Party, and there's also great potential, on the Republican side. I think it's really a race between the two parties, and we're talking about the Democratic Party. I'm going to give it a shout out in a sense to the Republican Party, is that they recognize some of the issues that stir the anxiety and stir this, you know, red baiting of socialism and communism for people who come from countries like Cuba and Venezuela and Central America. They're able to, you know, effectively, you know, flex that, you know, boogeyman of the red baiting, and it's effective for, again, the Cubans in Miami, effective for, you know, Tejanos and people along the Mexico-Texas border in Arizona. I think there's a future, but I'm going to say that the progressive wing of the party needs to really be bold and push for the issues, you know, many issues. I mean, we're not a monolithic population, but in my mind, there's a few issues that really kind of will define how the Democratic Party is going to be able to build relationships and loyalty. And that's immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform, that you know, it's, you know, based on the tradition of the U.S. welcoming immigrants and, you know, rewarding hard work and, you know, yes, abiding by the law, but at some point really saying enough is enough, and this is the immigration system that we will have as a country of immigrants. Two, the economy, of course. How will, especially in the clean energy world, how will this clean energy economy be accessible to young, you know, Latinos and people of color? If our current education system is not really preparing us for that high tech, you know, high science, high research, you know, dependent industry. So that's number two. Number three is that the Democratic wing of the party, and the Democratic Party needs to have an honest conversation about how it talks about quote unquote law and safety, but it really is a larger, broader conversation about public safety. Yes, you know, the Black Lives movement has, you know, shed a huge light on you know, police brutality on people of color and low-income communities also, but people of color also still need a relationship with public safety institutions. So can you trust them? Can they trust that they're going to come and protect them and not kill them? And then, but on the policy level, and this is very true also for the new wave of immigrants coming in from Central America and Mexico, is our obsession with this drug war, you know, really penalizing the supply side of the drug industry, which is, you know, countries like Mexico and Central America, it's like $5 billion plus industry, but we're not doing anything on the demand side. And I think that's one of the reasons I was reading about. One of the reasons why people along the Texas border went for Trump is that the Trump campaign was talking about, law enforcement and public safety, and like it or not, the cartels and the drug war is impacting people's public safety along the border states. And I was born in Mexico, and I'll tell you, I cannot go back and visit people in the state I was born in because literally people are being killed and beheaded, and that's a reality. And so it's really complicated, but I think that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party needs to have an honest conversation, how it talks to Latinx community about public safety and jobs and immigration and clean energy.
Thank you. We have one more question that it hopefully should be like a quick lightning round, and then that'll be the end of our event today. So as Fernando mentioned earlier, Princeton's endowment is not just big, it is $26 billion big. It's huge. We don't know how much of that is invested in fossil fuel. We're not meant to know, but let's just call it $1 billion. The train's waving goodbye as well. If we had $1 billion from the fossil fuel that we were reinvesting in communities like yours, how would you, if you had in your best wish, how would you respend that money in your community? And either one, whoever's so inspired to answer first.
I mean, I would do two things. I don't know if it's enough to cover the cost of it. One, I would cover all and give more tax revenue to the schools in the counties that desperately need it because of the dwindling tax revenue from the decline of fossil fuels, and create and build a high-speed rural broadband consumer cooperative for all of southwestern Pennsylvania and northern West Virginia, because broadband is like going to be the basis for people's access to the economic future, and we have little to no fast internet right now.
Thank you for those great. I would say two things as well. One is I would fund in partnership with others. I think the other thing is that $1 billion I've learned, it's a seed. I would partner with other big foundations to say a 10-year commitment to create a STEM or a clean energy career path for Black, Latino, low-income students and the most underserved or communities or highly impacted by the fossil fuel industry, and say that in 10 years we're going to take the students, or 12 years, the K-12 cycle is take them through so that when they finish, they can choose to go to to be professionals in the clean energy or the STEM world, or to go to elite institutions, but really take them on a different path and use that money and invest it. Two is I would invest it in community solar networks and community-owned community solar investments, especially along multi-unit affordable housing development. That's immediate, but those would be my two ideas.
Well, thank you both. That concludes, we're right at the hour. So that concludes the event for today. Thank you so much to Veronica Coptis and Fernando Cazares for coming to speak with us today. We are always interested in bringing in people outside the Princeton community, and Zoom kind of forces us to do that. This event, we got to do both, bring in Veronica and an alum who had a lot of experience in the issues that we're trying to talk about. So from here on out, you can continue to follow us between now and the end of the year. We'll have some new programming available as soon as all of our finals are done. And you can go to divestprinceton.com to learn more about the organization. You can endorse us. You can write letters of support for the cause to President Eisgruber if you're inspired to do that. All of that. And then for anyone that's here that might be an undergrad, we've got a referendum coming up very soon. That's referendum number 2 on the undergraduate student government ballot. Do vote yes to that if you are able to do that. You're a voting undergrad. Because we're hoping that will express the campus support for divestment as we continue our discussions with the administration. So thank you to everyone who showed up today, and this concludes. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Good luck in your campaign.